My name's Ron Earl. I'm a senior editor at The Deal, and we are the Activism Proxy Preview 2025 panel. We've seen a lot of activism this year, although it dipped shortly before the election, and I suspect the panel will be talking about how it's going to ramp up now that the election is over. We're going to start with a little bit of M&A activism, but first I thought everyone can do just a brief introduction of themselves, starting with Michael.
Thank you. I'm Michael Partridge. I'm an M&A securities partner at Goodman's in Toronto.
All right, Jeannie.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Carr. I am a senior managing director with McKinsey Partners, and we are a proxy solicitation firm.
I'm John Graw. I'm president and CEO of InvestorCom, and we are also a proxy solicitation firm.
Hi, I'm Brendan Fu. I'm the founder of Forward Risk. We're a corporate intelligence and investigations firm.
Okay, super. Thanks, Brendan, for that. So, and thanks everybody for the introduction. So, I'm going to throw this to Jeannie and Brendan, and anyone else who wants to tackle it. Wondering if we're going to see an uptick in M&A activism in the upcoming year. And I know we've heard in previous panels that they expect kind of a looser antitrust regime, maybe some one-off type deals, situations that incoming President Trump will want to get involved in personally, perhaps. And also foreign acquisitions of U.S. assets, particularly involving China, may be a problem. I think to add to that is other foreign acquisitions of outside of China, of assets that the Trump administration considers to be important assets will face a problem as well. But I don't know, Jeannie, do you expect to see more M&A activism? And what kind of M&A activism? Break up companies, divest an asset?
I do feel that we will see an uptick in M&A activism because we're going to see an uptick in M&A activity. So it's a correlation there. It's yet to be seen what type, although we can all somewhat agree that the first will probably be to sell off the company, followed a little bit by divestitures and spin-offs. But it'll be interesting to see what format it takes. But I do think that we're going to see more M&A activity.
Brendan?
Yeah, I think we're going to see, my voice. I think we're going to see some calls for breakups. I think we're going to see just more activity generally. One thing I'm hearing a lot of is just the increasing importance potentially of activists speaking with folks in the government relations and lobbying space now, because there could be some regulatory pushback. And while I think we are expecting regulatory regimes to sort of tone down a little bit in the next 4 years, there will still be pushback, and that does increase the potential need for a new breed of advisors in that space.
Interesting. And I just want to note that there was Elliott Management, one of the top tier activists, launched a campaign to break up Honeywell shortly after the election was concluded. Okay, John, tell us a little bit about proxy solicitation. Do you expect to see more small cap activism in 2025? And in that vein, I always think there's a lot of retail investors in small cap companies. I feel like retail investors historically have either not voted or been apathetic, or they vote for management. Are you seeing a change in that?
Yeah, well, I do expect to see an uptick in small cap activism in 2025. I kind of feel like I'm still getting over the 2024 proxy season. If not, I'm still involved in it. But with that being said, we are getting ready for the 25 proxy season, and I do expect it to be busier than ever. We seem to have a bit of a political theme the last couple of days. So as perhaps you could argue that people vote thinking of their wallets, while they also vote their proxy thinking of their wallets, and depending upon how their investment is going, retail investors are becoming more engaged in what's going on with their investments, and I think the ESG wave over the last number of years has had a bit to do with that. I mean, people, especially younger investors, have become a little more engaged with what's going on with the companies that they're buying. And this goes back to maybe 5 or 6 years ago with, meme stocks and online investing and people getting much more involved in that. So, years ago, retail investors were just known as sleepy investors. They never voted. They bought utility stocks, that type of thing. Now it's a lot more different. And believe me, I would be out of business if retail investors always voted and it was never a problem. But we do need to reach out to them. The first thing we do, and I know Jeannie will agree with this, is that when we get engaged by a company, we do a full analysis of who owns a company's stock, the balance of institutional holders versus retail, and out of that group of retail holders, who really is more likely to go out there and vote, and then we do an outreach to those retail holders. But I do see an uptick. I see an uptick in first-time small cap activists. There was probably a 20% increase in 2024 in first-time activists. I see that to increase even more. I think Universal Proxy helped with that this past year. That's when on a proxy ballot, you list both the management slate and the activist slate all on one proxy card. So yes, it's going to be a busy year.
Okay.
I
Go
also
ahead,
think
Julie.
too, John, don't you think we've made it easier for retail shareholders to vote? And we've made it easier because now they can vote on their smartphones. That wasn't around 10 years ago. Yeah, so that makes, and for exactly for this, the younger investors who are accustomed to voting that way, we just have to make sure the proxy material gets to them during very unique ways, during the mails, which is during emails, that type of thing, and we have to take out advertisements on different platforms now just to make them aware. But the voting process itself has become better and easier for these investors.
Absolutely.
So, Jeannie, so you think that the retail investors are becoming more engaged than they were like 10 years ago?
Absolutely.
Okay, very cool. All right, Michael, let's talk a little bit about trends of activism in Canada. There was some, I've been reporting on a couple of very high-profile activist situations, which I know you were involved in. I guess let's start with succession issues, and then I want to switch it to you guys for U.S. succession, CEO succession as a topic. We saw a huge amount of CEO succession campaigns in 2024. I part of wonder whether that was because maybe we saw a reduction in M&A activism, and so you had more operational succession issues. But you have like Starbucks and Norfolk Southern. Today was another Norfolk Southern that involved CEO succession. In Canada, you had the Gildan Activewear was kind of a reverse succession where that longtime founder was ousted and activists, including U.S. activists, brought him back. So do you see succession being a big issue in 2025? You're working on another case, this Dye & Durham, which also I feel like might involve succession. So in 2025, do you see succession being a big issue? And what other trends do you see in Canada in 2025 for activism?
Well, certainly it has been a big theme for 2024. Whether it repeats in 2025 is harder to predict because those tend to be such fact-specific situations. I think what we have seen is a more willingness on the part of activists to directly make CEO succession the issue in a campaign, as opposed to saying, the board is sort of, tainted with the sins of the management team, and therefore we've got to change the board to change the direction of the company. We're now seeing people directly targeting, this is the wrong CEO for this company, and we've got to make a change to the board so that we can change the CEO. We're used to that paradigm in Canada, but it used to be more limited to the smaller cap companies. And so you would see, particularly in the mining sector, a former CEO or founder who's left the company, whether willingly or unwillingly, still owns a big slug of stock and decides that the people who succeeded him aren't doing a great job and he wants to get back in. And so he enlists a couple of his buddies, maybe a fund, and runs a contest effectively to get his job back.
Return of the disgruntled ex-CEO founder.
Exactly. So it's not an unfamiliar scenario for us. What's changed is sort of it's moved up the food chain. And so, Gildan was a multi-billion-dollar market cap company. Dye & Durham, which you're referring to, is at least formerly a billion-dollar market cap company. And so we're seeing these types of battles becoming more prevalent at those larger companies, much like you're seeing in the U.S. with some of the examples that you've named. And so whether or not that trend continues into next year remains to be seen, but certainly in the right situations, we've seen that investors are certainly prepared to have those fights, and sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully.
Okay, so Brendan and Jeannie, what are your thoughts about CEO succession battles in the U.S. in 2025? I know that I would just note there's a very high-profile one right now where there was two activists. I've never seen this before. Two activists with both high-level CEO candidates, Mantleridge and D.E. Shaw, that they wanted to put onto Air Products and Chemicals. And remove the CEO and put their guy in. And then I think on one side, D. Shaw relented and is now shifting support for the Mantleridge campaign, who has his own CEO candidate. So anyways, there's a high-profile CEO succession campaign right now. What about in 2025?
I know that probably address this in the next panel as well, but when you talk about activism preparedness, that is one of the first things that we tell our clients. It's just good corporate governance, and it's what your investors are looking for, that you have a succession plan in place. And as a board member, I would suspect that you would want that as well. And I think you see that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big arguments that came up in Disney and why the particular directors who were targeted was because of a failure of succession planning. I think you can, like, one other element I see with succession is, you know, when you think about when activists choose to strike, it typically is when a company is at its most vulnerable or there's big change happening. And we had a situation this year where the activists came in and went public right around the time the company just had a new CEO. But this was actually a really good story because they were well advised. They had a really good succession plan. The GC, IR, everyone was in it together, and so they actually engaged really well with the activists because the CEO had been prepped. The CEO had been part of the discussion even leading up to the succession planning. And so when the activists nominated, you know, they were able to get everything done really quickly. And it was a real good success story. The activists came up and said, you know, like, we're really proud of the way they did their succession. We're here behind them. We're looking forward to engaging with them and helping them to do really well in the next couple of years. So goods and bads, you know, but I think succession is something that you can, if you are a company, you can use it to your advantage. But if you mismanage it, as we've seen, everything can go wrong.
And Jeannie, how do institutional investors view CEO succession? Is this a topic that if it's a company that doesn't really have a plan, they will support the activists?
Oh, well, a lot depends there, but that's definitely something that even in a non-contested situation, when we have our off-season engagement, which is right now, this is off-season engagement period, right. A lot of the investors, when we have our conversations with them, and they're very informal conversations, because you're not asking them for a vote. It's a very give and take, and that's something on their checklist. Like, do you have a succession plan in place? We want to make sure that you do. And if you don't, it's something that's relatively easy to ensure that you get brownie points for that, especially if an activist is coming down. You want to get yourself as bulletproof as possible for an activism campaign, and that's something that you can do.
Okay. All right, super. Okay, so Brendan, I have another one for you. We've seen an explosion in recent years of people leaving top-tier activist funds and forming their own activist funds. We saw, and then there's other situations where somebody would leave a big fund like Elliott Management and go to a different fund and kind of run the activism effort at that investor. And you know, Starboard Value had some people leaving them, Pershing Square, number of people like that, Paul Halal left to form Mantleridge. And so I feel like in 2024, we saw at least 4 or 5 examples of new funds forming with activist portfolio managers that left the bigger funds. So do you think that that's something we'll see in 2025?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think my theory is that it's a matter of time because, you know, these guys have been doing it in bigger firms for a while. You get your experience and you think to yourself, hey, can I do the same thing? There's a lot of money sloshing around that they're all looking for superior returns. So give it to the guys who have, or the guys or girls who have really good ideas and convictions about what to do with that, with those funds. I think the barriers to entry are lower as well. Activism has lost a lot of its stigma from, like 10, 20 years ago. You now have more directors who are willing to be on activist slates. You have a lot more advisors on both sides, lawyers, proxy solicitors, PR firms, investigators, folks that are willing to play both sides now. You have also just, for some of them, lower barriers to entry when they swarm with other activists. So you don't necessarily need to take pole position. You can be part of a group. You could be part of a collaborative group, or you could be, making the same investment theses and just be in the same positions and kind of play off each other and kind of mess things up a little bit in some cases, but also in some other cases, there are potential strategic advantages to be had if you wanted to play white squire or if you wanted to play different parties off of each other. So I think because it's so prolific, because there's so many people doing it, within that complexity lies some opportunities for the really well-advised, smart activists, especially those who have built their experience in bigger shops to just do something a little bit different and find a niche for themselves.
I feel like some of the smaller, they would leave the big funds because when they start their own fund, they can go after smaller, easier to drive change at companies, where at the bigger ones, they have to go after, like Elliott has to go after Honeywell to make a difference with their assets under management. But, and of course they have their own fund, so they're calling the shots. So
it's helpful for us because in Canada, much of our activism is really driven by US-based funds. Mm-hmm. There really is not a lot of domestic capital devoted to, at least exclusively to activism strategies. And so the more smaller activism shops there are down here, the more activity we see in Canada because our companies tend to be smaller. And there's only so many companies in Canada that Elliott would be interested in, but a much broader group of companies that one of these spin-off shops might think about going after because it's a smaller check, it's easier to manage, all that stuff. So
yeah, I thought it was fascinating that it was an LA-based activist fund, Browning West, that led the charge at Gildan Activewear in Montreal.
Right.
So, okay, I want to switch to John and Jeannie on a topic that I think is related to the election a little bit, and that is the proxy advisors. Institutional shareholder services and Glass Lewis are hugely influential in kind of driving outcomes in many ways. If they recommend in favor of a distant slate, they recommend in favor of an incumbent slate. And so, Jeannie, you talked about how you've seen a lot of people that used to work at ISS and Glass Lewis go to the advisory space. And so why is that? I mean, I guess part of it is maybe it's hard to really understand how ISS is going to, what they're going to conclude.
Well, what we've always told our clients is to think about ISS as being as one of your top 5 shareholders. They're that influential in contested and even non-contested situations. So if you've got someone that's been in charge, and I know you're here, Chris, in charge of ISS for their contested situation, they know how that company works, and they know what to look for and what not to look for, what works from their point of view, what is just smoke and mirrors from a proxy advice, from a institutional side or from a company side or even from an activist side. And it's really nice to get their perspective because we can only imagine how they work. And I've been at a couple of ISS meetings, but to have someone with ISX interior experience on your team is brilliant and extremely helpful.
No, I agree with that 100%. I think that the fact that there is a lot of former ISS and Glass Lewis personnel scattered amongst some of the advisors is extremely helpful. I just want to caution that, and I know Jeannie will agree with me, I hope so, that understanding the dynamic of how ISS and Glass Lewis fits into the decision-making process of any one shareholder vote is extremely nuanced. You really need to understand whether or not there is influence, and if there is, the actual level of influence. So there's really a lot of analysis that goes into that. But the fact that there are many experts scattered within the advisory community
People that worked at ISS and Glass Lewis.
Yeah, for
And-
sure.
and,
Is tremendous. It's great value.
Yeah, I think
But
we
none
have
of them come to a proxy firm. Why is that?
We have to work on that.
I think we have somebody in the audience that was one of the founders, and he'll be on a panel soon on Chris Young, one of the founders of the Special Situations Group, which is a division of ISS that specifically deals with proxy fights that the activists launch. So definitely something I'll be keeping an eye on, where all these ISS and Glass Lewis, there's some high-profile Glass Lewis people have gone to work as advisors in activist situations. So.
But even, I'm sorry for interrupting,
Go ahead,
I
Chief.
thought about this earlier today, and even in non-contested situations, because now with shareholder engagement, especially let's say you have a low vote on your compensation, and the advisory firms want to see in your following year's proxy statement that you did outreach to your investors to understand why the vote was low and what the company can do to make the vote go better in the following year. So it's still coming new and everybody's writing different things. I would love to have the opportunity to sit with somebody at either ISS or Glass Lewis after we come up with what we think is a good description in our proxy statement and just ask them, how do you think this looks? Could I tweak this another way to make it better for your team to understand? And so it's also helpful in non-contested situations as well.
I'm really curious to see whether the Trump administration SEC will bring back these ISS Glass Lewis rules that the Jay Clayton SEC had adopted. I was told that they're already written, they were removed during the Gary Gensler, they could just put them back very easily, which would, one of the things I think would require the company response attached to the ISS recommendation. So I think that would be interesting if they do bring that back. So, okay, let's talk about the quality of candidates. Maybe Brendan wants to grab this, or anybody wants to try to chat about that a little bit. I feel like the quality of candidates that the activists are producing has really increased a lot. And like I mentioned with the Air Products case, we had two high-profile ex-CEOs that the two activists wanted to install on the board of a company. You have situations where activists are hiring ex-executives to advise them, and sometimes they're becoming director candidates. So talk a little bit about the quality of candidates, and maybe you wanted to also talk about more sophisticated advisors. I don't know if you wanted to.
Yep.
Try that.
Always fun to take on a multi-part question at the same time, but I'm going to try my best.
Do it.
I would say, look, director quality continues to be one of the most important parts of a proxy contest, but it doesn't live on its own. So, you need good quality candidates, you need a good thesis, you also need a good set of representations to the market as a whole. So it really is a joint effort that does take the entire team coming together to make the right case. That being said, right, ultimately it comes down to the votes if you were to take it all the way to that stage. And that's where, that's why I still have a job, because when we look into director quality, when we look into directors and management, that's going to be the stuff that most clearly helps our clients to make a case as to whether or not particular individuals should be voted up or down. I think one thing to think about with director quality as well is that, I talked earlier about how the stigma of being an activist nominee has kind of gone away. It used to be, I think, I'm pretty young, but when I first started doing this, you had a couple of those same names that would come up again and again and again. Again, there's this one candidate who I must have investigated like 5 times in a row, because she just kept getting put on every single board because she was the best and had the right skill set. I think we're seeing more people who have the right skill set who are being tapped for directorships, and that comes down to just this is, I think, a generally more acceptable form of just investing now. The other thing is, you asked me about former executives. I think there is a lot of value there, and it's part
to get ex-executives to advise the activists.
Exactly, and it's part of the whole idea of, how board refreshments and sort of this defensive posture shouldn't just be something that companies do when there's an activist at the gates, but it is something that a well-advised or a well-run company thinks about during peacetime, such that they're thinking about refreshments, they're thinking about, keeping the board fresh, keeping the board ready, so that they can then, in some ways, neutralize a potential activist argument against them for having an entrenched and overly long-serving board. So they, former executives, they know the board, they know the C-suite, they know the strategy. As we've seen in recent days, recent weeks, there might be pitfalls when using former executives, but generally, I think it is a very clever way of showing credibility.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say, I think that the importance of board quality was really brought home in the Gildan Activewear proxy contest, where Browning West was successful in replacing the entire board and bringing the former CEO back in no small measure because they brought forward a truly world-class level of candidates to put onto the board who, with the benefit of their experience and speaking to the former CEO, were able to put together a plan for the company that was so compelling that ISS was prepared to recommend in favor of the entire dissident slate.
Not something they do very often.
Replacing the entire incumbent board. And so without that quality of candidate, they may not have been able to get that result, which was really a key factor in the success that they ultimately were able to achieve.
Remind me how many, because the company also tried to do what I call, or a lot of people in the industry call a defensive refresh, where they bring
Right.
on a bunch of new directors, the incumbent management-backed directors, in hopes that institutional investors will support that they've made change. But in this case, that wasn't enough, right?
That's
how many
right.
directors were?
It was
basically
essentially the entire board had turned over
And then
by the
replaced.
time you got to the proxy contest, and then they were then replaced with the dissident slate.
Yeah, no, this is kind of I want to say unprecedented situation in terms of the level of oversight. So we only have a few minutes left. I just wanted to throw it open to the audience if anybody has any questions at all. Yep, over there.
It's been a pleasure meeting folks from Canada who want to come down to Palm Beach. Thanks again for you. Just a question for practitioners outside of the U.S. If we're going into Canada and meeting like some clients or trying to look from the outside, the old days it used to be like a 1 cent fee that you could pay, a whole bunch of other sort of Canadian nuances. Activism. What are the things that sort of U.S. guys going into Canada don't always appreciate or know on day one of an activist?
Yeah, I actually gave a whole spiel about this last year, so maybe we can find the recording and send it to you. But I think the biggest thing that U.S. activists tend to focus on and appreciate when they're looking at Canadian targets is we are not limited to the AGM cycle for board refreshment or replacement activities. 5% plus shareholders in Canada do have the ability to requisition a special meeting at any time, which sounds great. The practicalities of that are sometimes dilute the effectiveness of it in real life, but it is a real strategic benefit that an activist looking at a Canadian name has that they do not have in the US, and it opens up a whole different set of playbooks and alternatives in terms of thinking through strategy and how and when to go at a company in terms of looking for board refreshment.
I just want to kind of dig into that just for a minute more, because I know in the U.S. we sometimes see activists threaten to do special shareholder meetings at companies that allow it. Some companies allow it, a lot of companies don't allow it. For example, Elliott threatened and was moving forward towards a special shareholder meeting at Southwest Airlines to elect a change of control slate. But in the U.S., you need a majority of outstanding shares, I think in many cases, to win at a special shareholder meeting, whereas at an annual meeting, you need just a majority of voting shares. But in Canada, when you requisition a special shareholder meeting or extraordinary meeting, you just need a majority of voting shares, right? Or
Except in British Columbia, yeah.
Okay.
That's right. So there are nuances, but it is much easier in Canada to do something off cycle than it is in the US is kind of the bottom line.
Okay. Yeah, voting shares makes it much easier to win a proxy, but I think it's much more difficult if it's outstanding shares. And I think Elliott knew that, and they were not excited about going forward with that proxy fight. But anyways, that's aside. I don't know, I think we're basically out of time. So I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to participate in this panel. Thank you, Brendan, John, Jeannie, and Michael.